would like to welcome you to the second Thucydides Lecture, which is organized by the departments, International, Defense, and European Analysis Institute. As you know, probably from the previous time, the Thucydides Lectures are introduced by the department, approved by the department, in order to promote research on Thucydides, and to that end, we are inviting scholars from all over the world. Now, Professor Seth and Jaffe is an assistant professor at the Cabot University, Rome, Italy, and he became known with his book Thucydides on the Outbreak of War, Character and Contest. He's a political scientist. He's doing research on political theory, and tonight he's going to speak. His topic is Peloponnesian Warnings, Revising the Thucydides Trap. Now, I think I've said enough and a lot. I'll give the floor to Professor Jaffe. He will make his presentation, and then we'll pass to a Q&A session, question and answers, and I hope you will participate as usually actively. Now, Professor Jaffe has the floor.
So thank you very much for having me here today, and to Professor Thucydides for his kind introduction. I'm grateful to the Institute of International, European, and Defense Analysis and the University of Macedonia for hosting this event, for all of you for attending this event, and I'm particularly honored to be able to contribute to a lecture series on Thucydides, an author that is very dear to my heart. I don't use any PowerPoint, as is probably clear, so I will try to keep you all awake and engaged through the terrifying specter of great power war and ambient Thucydidean electricity. So given the potential diversity of today's audience, the presence of faculty and perhaps students from a variety of subfields, I've tried to craft a broadly accessible and I hope interesting interdisciplinary talk about my recent research on Thucydides' history of the Peloponnesian War, particularly as it pertains to the so-called Thucydides trap. 2012 coinage of the American political scientist and foreign policy analyst Graham Allison of Harvard University's Kennedy School of Government. For those of you more familiar with the history, bear with me as I put some of the key elements into place. We can, of course, also take it up a notch in the question period. Now, the idea of a Thucydides' trap is drawn from Thucydides' famous line about the inevitability of a Peloponnesian War, which occurs at 123.6 of the first book of the history, the one surrounding the origins of the Great War. Allison maintains the dynamic that Thucydides identified at play in the outbreak of that ancient war is presently at play in the US-China relationship, and moreover, that it could all too easily lead to an unanticipated great power war. For my part, in 2017, I published a book entitled, as was mentioned, Thucydides on the Outbreak of War, Character and Contest, and which offers a new reading of Thucydides' account of the origins of the Peloponnesian War. Now that book, I should note, does not directly engage the Thucydides trap concept or literature, and indeed intentionally so. Instead, it is principally addressed to political theorists and classicists interested in 5th century Greek thought, and to those interested in the history of ancient warfare, and not to IR scholars or public policy makers. My own academic training, however, is partly in international relations, and as both a student and teacher of American foreign policy, this talk today represents part of an ongoing effort to begin translating elements of my interpretation of Thucydides into the IR and policymaking idiom. Because I think that the arguments of my book have certain implications for how we ought to understand Thucydides' vision of international politics. There's also another reason that I'm interested in the idea of a Thucydides trap. The very notion of such a trap represents a test of the enduring value of Thucydides himself, a subject to which I will return. Now, to use the key translation of the line at 123.6 of the history that is always quoted in these discussions, and this is from the Crawley translation. It was, in Thucydides' opinion, and I quote, the growth of the power of Athens, or more literally, the Athenians becoming great, and the alarm or fear which this inspired in Sparta made war inevitable or necessary or compulsory, end quote. Now, political scientists generally take this authorial statement to be a law-like generalization, a proto-social scientific theory, if you will, about an interactive dynamic that generates war between rising or revisionist powers and ruling or status quo ones. In simple terms, a rising power inspires fear or apprehension in a status quo or relatively declining power, or relatedly, encroaches upon its perceived interest in intolerable ways, and this dynamic eventually lights a fuse leading to war. Political communities, in other words, fight either to maintain the balance of power or to overturn it. The famous Thucydidean line was first applied to the US-China relationship by Allison in the Financial Times in 2012 in a piece entitled, quote, Thucydides' trap has been sprung in the Pacific, end quote, and subsequently updated and expanded in a much-cited article in the Atlantic Monthly in 2015 entitled The Thucydides Trap, Are the US and China Headed for War? Allison's book-length treatment of the subject, Destined for War, Can America and China Escape Thucydides' Trap, appeared in 2017 and has been making waves ever since. A 2017 Politico story suggested the White House was reading Thucydides. Allison briefed Trump's National Security Council on the Thucydides trap, and importantly, there are signs that the US-China relation, especially on trade, is becoming increasingly contentious. Allison's Thucydides trap concept has therefore not remained a mere academic trope. Both Chinese President Xi Jinping and former US President Barack Obama explicitly referenced denying or disavowing or qualifying the existence of the dynamic Allison identifies. I am not yet aware of any direct Donald J. Trump quotation as to the dynamic, although Jim Mattis, the former Secretary of Defense and H.R. McMaster, the former U.S. National Security Advisor, were avowed Thucydidophiles. Thucydides even appeared, as some of you may know, in the recent Wonder Woman movie. There was a quote attributed to him in that film, which appears nowhere in the pages of the history. Now, as all of you, I'm sure, will know, the Amazons were the mythical enemies of the ancient Athenians, and so are clearly untrustworthy on any number of accounts. But with that framework in place, let me offer you the structure of my remaining presentation this evening. To discuss the Thucydides trap in an informed way, I need to first introduce you, or for most of you, reintroduce you to Thucydides' history as I understand it. Second, to articulate Allison's trap concept. Third, to sketch my own vision of Thucydides' account of the outbreak of the Peloponnesian War, particularly as it pertains to the inevitability of the conflict, this being the most common Greek translation of the classical Greek word for necessity or compulsion. And here I will apologize for my terrible Erasmian pronunciation that your audience will be more alive to than other audiences. So, ananke in the Erasmian, ananki or anangi in the modern Greek. So fourth, then I'm going to try to bring the several threads together to offer a reformulation of the Thucydides trap concept if fidelity to Thucydides himself is our goal. To put the Thucydides back into the trap, as it were. And in this context, I'll offer a concluding meditation on how Donald Trump and Xi Jinping may play into the dynamics under discussion. So my remaining presentation will be roughly 35-40 minutes or so, and I'll then be happy to field any questions or to endure your recriminations. So before turning to the Thucydides trap, I need to give you a very telegraphic framing sketch of the Peloponnesian War itself, and then to outline my understanding of the purpose of Thucydides' work, a book which is arguably the greatest extant prose work from the great 5th century efflorescence in Greece, a masterpiece of classical political thought, and a revealing study of the first democracy at war, Athens, an imperial democratic city. Now, as most of you will know, the history is also a canonical book for the student of international politics. There are even Thucydides chairs in strategic studies. I think there should be one perhaps at every university. Indeed, I personally believe the history to be a kind of manual for citizens, soldiers, and statesmen. This was the subject of a recent workshop I gave at the Kennedy School at Allison's behest to his applied applied history program. For our purposes today, however, it is worth emphasizing that Thucydides is generally conceived of as the first scholar of international relations. Thucydides, paleo-realist or realist, and there is a virtual cottage industry of articles on what kind of realist Thucydides actually is. But first things first, the basics. What was the Peloponnesian War? So the war we call Peloponnesian, what historians today sometimes call the Second Peloponnesian War, this, the subject of Thucydides' life's work and the defining event of his life, was a 27-year conflict between the two preeminent city-states of Greece, Athens and Sparta. It spanned the years 431 to 404 BC. It was a long war and an enormously destructive one. For our purposes, it might best be compared to World War I and the scope and scale of its destruction. Now, to give a sense of the magnitude of that destruction, scholars have argued, and I should say that ancient population numbers are highly contested, so these numbers are just estimates, but scholars have argued that Athens had around 60,000 citizen households in 431 BC at the beginning of the war. That's a high estimate. And that by the end of the war, in 404, Athens had only 15,000 citizen households remaining, which is a low estimate. But if you think for a moment about the percentage loss of population in a single generation, so now you have at least a working sense of the scale of the conflict. Who were the war's contestants, and what was the character of their content? Well, in 5th century Greece, as most of you know, Sparta was the preeminent land power, the leader of the Peloponnesian League, a primarily defensive alliance of mainly oligarchical city-states. Athens, by contrast, was the preeminent naval power and democracy, the first democracy, a direct democracy, not a representative one like those today, something closer to what we would call an illiberal democracy. Athens, for her part, was outfitted with an unmatched navy, and because of her great walls that stretched down to encircle her military harbor, Piraeus, the city was unassailable by land, a fortified island. Athens was then a naval empire, and she dominated the islands of the Aegean, while also harboring a thirst and indeed a talent for imperial expansion. Now, in addition to the comparative material advantages of the sides, their hard power, as we would now term it, the cities also had opposing characters. A theme that we will return to since, as Professor Thucydides has mentioned, my own research has been bound up with the character of regimes in Thucydides' pages. Now, in terms of the character of the two cities, whereas Spartan power was long-standing and Sparta a conservative or maintaining power, Athenian power was relatively new, and Athens was a progressive, acquisitive city, a daring, expansionistic power. What then is Thucydides' own enterprise in his recreation of this long war? Why did he write it up for posterity? So contrary to what some people may think from my free use of the title, The History of the Peloponnesian War, Thucydides did not write a work entitled The History. This is simply, again, a title handed down to us by posterity. Indeed, in my view, at least, perhaps one that is unsurprisingly not shared by ancient historians, although perhaps by political scientists, the conceptual freighting that attends the word history risks obscuring the character of the Thucydidean project as Thucydides himself seems to understand that project. Professor Thucydides simply terms the work the war, which I find congenial to my own interpretive interests. Now, Thucydides famously writes that he intends his book to be a possession for all time on the ground that the future will resemble the past. But how can a past thinker assert that his work will be a possession for all time or for everlasting, to use Thomas Hobbes's felicitous translation of our key line? Thucydides asserts that he has written his history, quote, for whosoever wishes to examine the truth of the things that have happened and of the like things that will happen again, according to the nature of human beings or the human thing, Cabot. In other words, the essence of the things that have happened and will happen again is the human thing, which runs through past, present, and future times. There is then some bright, recurrent thread of human nature that runs through the customary or cultural differences characterizing different historical epochs, or such appears to be the Thucydidean suggestion. So history as a singular chain of events will not repeat itself. Nonetheless, individual episodes of Thucydides' history are somehow constructed to disclose more recurrent or universal phenomena. So to give the example relevant for our purposes today, it's my view that Thucydides' account of the causes of the Peloponnesian War, the first 146 chapters or paragraphs of the work, are intended to shed light on the permanent human causes of war. chain of events Thucydides chooses to depict in his first book, the fuse snaking toward the powder keg of the Peloponnesian War, or more precisely, the manner in which Thucydides depicts these events is intended to bring out what is somehow characteristic or representative about it. So on the basis of what I've said so far, you can see why I earlier noted that the Thucydides trap is a test of Thucydides himself. And indeed, this is what interests me most about the contemporary appeal to Thucydides. Is he really relevant? Is there such a thing as a Thucydides trap? And if so, what is its character? Or to frame the question differently, how might we apply a Thucydidean frame to the US-China relationship? And what would such a framework reveal about potential pathways to conflict? So before sketching Graham Allison's Thucydides trap concept, and for the purpose of full disclosure, I should admit to having a personal connection to Allison. I worked for Graham a number of years ago when I was close to the age of many of the undergraduates here in a research capacity at Harvard's Kennedy School, mostly on issues of nuclear security. This was before he had an interest in Thucydides. In recent years, however, we have been in touch about Thucydides a little bit, in particular have discussed our respective views on the outbreak of the Peloponnesian War. This said, just between all of us and the video over here, my view of the Thucydides trap is somewhat different than Allison's, though I should tell you that I'm broadly sympathetic to his efforts, which I'll return to. Indeed, it was at his suggestion I published an op-ed in the National Interest in October 2015, and a longer piece in the national security blog War on the Rocks in 2017, where I offered elements of my own view of the trap concept. This talk represents an expanded statement of those more compressed arguments. A co-author of mine who works on Chinese politics will deliver her portion of our collaborative and ongoing project at the IASA meetings in Toronto in 2 weeks' time, focusing on power transition in the Navy and cyber realms, drawing from something of the framework of my book. But let's turn to Allison's Thucydides trap. In the already noted 2012 FT piece, Allison exhorted the United States and China to avoid Thucydides' trap, by which he meant a series of events that could lead to an unintended war between a rising power, China, and a ruling one, the United States. Allison maintained that the two countries' ability to avoid this trap is, quote, the defining question about global order in the decades ahead, end quote. He still maintains that, and he has doubled down on the claim of his book in many subsequent articles and interviews. He's also been regularly meeting with various Chinese officials. He goes to China about once a month. In short, Allison continues to believe that we are still headed for war, or, more weakly, major conflict short of complete war. Now, during the Cold War, as some of you will know, Thucydides was mapped onto the great power rivalry between the United States and the Soviet Union, with the Soviet Union a garrison state with superior land power in the role of a modern Sparta, and the United States a democracy with a true blue water navy in the role of ancient Athens. In many respects, this makes more intuitive sense than China as Athens and the United States as Sparta, as it is in Allison's framing, a subject to which I will return. Now, in the idiom of contemporary IR, Thucydides is often considered a classical realist, along with, say, Hans Morgenthau, which is to say he's understood to be an analyst of political life who finds the causes of war and conflict largely within human nature itself, which is what IR scholars sometimes call a first image claim. But Thucydides' work, perhaps unsurprisingly, has also been appropriated by neo-realists, who maintain that his treatment of the causes of war is in fact a structural argument, one rooted in the wider distribution of power and capabilities, or what Kenneth Waltz, the father of neo-realism, terms a third image claim. In this last vein, as many of you know, Thucydides has often been claimed by proponents of hegemonic stability theory or power transition theory, which seek in part to explain great power war, the latest and most popular version being Allison's Thucydides trap. Thucydides, in other words, has been understood as a power transition theorist long before Allison's application of Thucydides to the US-China relationship. Allison, then, in other words, injected what has previously gone by the academic name of power transition theory into mainstream public policy debates about the US-China relationship under the catchy rubric of a Thucydides trap. Allison's argument also, however, goes beyond Thucydides' history. He argues that the peaceful rise of China would defy the historical odds, which is to say that he introduces an empirical claim on the basis of select additional cases about the causes of great power war. In this vein, he and his Belfer Center team have begun a Thucydides project to track instances of conflict between ruling powers and the rising powers that threaten to displace them. They have identified 16 cases over the past 500 years, In 12, according to Allison and his team's interpretation of the cases, the outcome was war. If any of you are interested, you can explore these cases in the intended methodology on the Belfer Center website. Now, in the Washington Monthly, in June of 2016, in a piece entitled, a clever title, The Thucydides Claptrap, the constructivist scholar Ned Lebow, who has himself written extensively on Thucydides, along with the noted classicist Daniel Tompkins, rejected Allison's Thucydides trap concept entirely, largely by rejecting Allison's reliance on the word inevitable in the lines I have quoted several times. Lebow, for his part, has a 2010 book entitled Why Nations Fight from Cambridge University Press, which offers case studies about the origins of modern war, and he comes to a very different conclusion than Allison, while offering an attack against power transition theory more broadly. I should note that I'm not in a position here tonight to evaluate or adjudicate the empirical evidence about the relative incidence of war between rising powers and ruling ones. I haven't studied Allison's cases with the requisite care. But with regard to Thucydides, I can tell you that I disagree with Lebow and Tompkins' interpretation of our key line at 126. They maintain the word frequently translated as inevitability or necessity or compulsion is really best translated as pressure. But the Thucydidean intention is something stronger than that, I think, although Professor Christovelis here may disagree with me. But Graham Allison doesn't really intend his Thucydides trap as an intervention in rarefied debates among academic political scientists. He has bigger fish to fry. He is speaking directly to US and Chinese policymakers. And why speak to policymakers if war is inevitable? I mean, why bother? If it's going to happen anyway, why have that conversation? Now, Allison does this, of course, because he does not really think that war is inevitable, but instead that the likelihood of war is far greater than the principal actors realize, the United States and China, and that policymakers on both sides would do well to reflect on this fact. And of course, because they should all buy Allison's book, and thereby avoid an avoidable war. Now, Professor Christovelis and I are both of the opinion that they should also buy our book, right? If they're going to buy Allison's. And with over 80 million members of the Communist Party in China, we could both retire in a very good way. Now, as some of you will know, U.S. PACOM, Pacific Command, or what has actually just been renamed Indo-PACOM as of last year, is the largest U.S. military deployment in the world, the largest American United Combatant Command, while Obama, in the later years of his presidency, initiated a rebalancing or pivot toward the Pacific. Incidentally, this was to be part of the strategy of George W. Bush's administration prior to the attacks of September 11th of 2001. Allison's exhortation for the U.S. and China to avoid a Thucydides trap then, and his own strategic or rhetorical use of the language of war's inevitability, is rooted in his desire to focus the minds of the actors on the clear and present dangers of war, and in this effort, again, he's been successful. In 2015, Thucydides loomed large over the summit between President Obama and Xi Jinping. On September 22nd, 2015, President Xi remarked the following, quote, "There is no such thing as the so-called Thucydides trap in the world, but should major countries time and again make the mistakes of strategic miscalculation, they might create such traps for themselves," end quote. Now, in 2017, Xi Jinping added the following, quote, "We must all strive to avoid falling into Thucydides' trap. The notion that a great power is bound to seek hegemony does not apply to China, which lacks the gene that spawns such behavior. As you will see, while I will agree that strategic calculation, or indeed miscalculation, is the likely path to war, I would strongly disagree that China lacks the hegemonic gene." Obama, for his part, in that same 2015 meeting, remarked that he doesn't believe in a Thucydides trap or in the inevitability of conflict between the U.S. and China. Instead, he formally announced that, quote, "The United States welcomes the rise of a China that is peaceful, stable, prosperous, and a responsible player in global affairs." Well, who wouldn't? But on the basis of my interpretation of Thucydides, at least, Xi and Obama get the character of the Thucydides trap wrong. Of course, again, it's not really their fault. They all read Allison's book and not our books. But Trump, for his part, as some of you will know, is not much of a reader. But his rhetoric and actions toward China is a source of concern with regard to some of the dynamics that Allison is pointing to. Now, in my view, these leaders get the trap wrong because they interpret it essentially as a third image claim, or as principally an argument about a shift in the balance of power between status quo powers and revisionist ones, a series of dynamics somehow external to the actors. Yet in my view, such third image claims are fundamentally underdetermined with regard to explaining how precisely structural stresses, which may in fact be the product of the shifting balance of power, lead to the very miscalculation referenced by President Xi. Now, Allison's book, Destined for War, more directly addresses this deficiency by exploring how various sparks involving Taiwan or South Korea or North Korea or Japan could spiral in the direction of an unintended conflict. Now, Trump's escalating trade war with China, the Trump administration's 2018 national defense strategy, where China appears as America's primary geopolitical competitor, Trump's increasing closeness to Taiwan, and the very recent October 2018 naval encounter between a U.S. warship, the USS Decatur, and a Chinese warship, an extraordinary Chinese provocation in response to a U.S. freedom of navigation operation near the Strait of Maine. All of these are sort of pathways that could rapidly lead to conflict. If you look at the photos of the encounter between the USS Decatur and this Chinese warship, they claim that the Chinese warship was within 45 yards of the American ship, but it was closer and forced the American ship to take evasive maneuvers. What is my own interpretation of the causes of the Peloponnesian War offer with regard to the Thucydides trap dynamic that I've been sketching so far? So, to address this question, let me offer a schematic outline of my account of the causes of the Peloponnesian War. So, in my reading of Thucydides' first book, the one concerning the origins of the war, that's the 146 chapters, I think that I've proved that Thucydides' account of necessity or inevitability ultimately points toward the characters of the Athenian and Spartan regimes, disclosing a Thucydidean preoccupation with nature, thesis, and convention, nomos, which are 5th century BC intellectual themes, common among the sophists and later Plato and Aristotle. They loosely correspond in today's language to nature and nurture. So what does that mean in simpler terms? With regard to the outbreak of the Peloponnesian War, Athens is the expansionistic power, Sparta the status quo one. When the strategic prerogatives of an expanding, acquisitive power collide with the abiding interests of a maintaining one, well, at that moment, according to Thucydides, the Peloponnesian War becomes somehow necessary. But necessary in a human sense. The actors themselves, for various reasons, were unable to entertain other courses of action. In other words, in my view, necessity in Thucydides proves bound up with regime character. Crucially, it is not fully external to the actors. Stated another way, the character of rising Athenian power is just as important to the outbreak of the Peloponnesian War as is the character of Spartan apprehension. Thucydidean necessity, to put the point on the interpretive matter, is firmly bound up with what IR scholars term the second image, with regime character. Let me explain. Throughout his whole work, Thucydides frequently disarticulates the constituents of political decision-making and shows them to his readers. I suspect Professor Christoubelis would agree with me on at least that point. What does it mean to talk about the constituents or elements of decision-making? Well, when actors make decisions, any actors, including all of you, but also including states, they forever bring attitudes, plans, intentions, or dispositions to their concrete circumstances. In every decision, we observe the encounter between some antecedent, background, disposition, or attitude, and a concrete circumstance. At any and every moment, then, the circumstances matter. What we could, in this case, call the strategic positionality of the actors vis-a-vis one another. But so too do the characteristic dispositions or attitudes or beliefs that the actors bring to their circumstances, which is to say, the actors' own perception of their strategic circumstances, which are themselves, in the Thucydidean presentation, rooted in background conceptions of the national interest. To use a very simple example by way of illustration, a cautious human being brings a cautious demeanor to her circumstances, and indeed conceives of her interests in cautious ways, whereas a daring person, a bold person, brings a daring attitude and conceives of her interest in some more daring manner. The circumstances faced by these actors might be identical, but the actors themselves bring something genuinely different to the table, which shapes their perception of the necessities or imperatives which they face at a given moment. Now, Thucydides, for his part, maintains that not only do individuals act on the basis of identifiable psychological drives, traits, or dispositions. The programmatic ones in Thucydides are those for security, honor, and profit, but crucially, so do political communities. Cities or states evince corporate characters or tempers, perhaps even tragic flaws. And here Thucydides is probably drawing from the template of Greek tragedy, personifying cities as actors in the global drama of international politics. Stated even more simply, Thucydides suggests that political communities behave in identifiable ways. Athens, you will recall, is a daring power, and Sparta a cautious one, and so the city's actions reflect these predispositions. If political communities do, in fact, evince characteristic corporate tendencies, then we can speak of typical Athenian behavior, or typical Spartan behavior, or indeed characteristic American behavior in the South China Sea, or characteristic Chinese behavior in the East China Sea. Athens is daring, Sparta is cautious. Again, these dispositions are independent of the strategic positionality of the cities within the larger international system of ancient Greece. Solely in terms of the changing balance of power, Athens is the rising power, Sparta is the status quo. But crucially, one could imagine a cautious riser and a daring maintainer, as opposed to a daring riser, Athens, and a cautious maintainer, Sparta. And indeed, this first dynamic would better seem to capture the US-China relationship than the more simplistic mapping or transposition of Athens onto China and Sparta onto the United States. In the case of China and the US, the rising power, China, appears more relatively Spartan, we might say, speaking anachronistically, while the maintaining power is more Athenian. And if Donald Trump's concrete actions vis-a-vis China are as inflammatory as his rhetoric has sometimes been, this could have serious implications for the US-China relationship. Now, Xi Jinping's tenure so far has been characterized by a growing Chinese assertiveness, and I would wager that this trend will only accelerate. Let us return for the moment to the issue of necessity or inevitability. This again, the Greek word ananti. If you trace out all of the uses of the term in Thucydides' first book, and don't worry, you don't have to do it, I've done it for you, you discover the term refers, I think, to the point of contact between a city's corporate character and its strategic circumstance. Necessity, in my reading, appears to be something like the imperatives of the national interest, as the political community in question understands those interests. Necessity relates then to the ends that communities seek, to their conceptions of the advantageous things, to use Thucydidean lingo, or to a community's perception of its strategic interests. Necessity, then, is bound up with the actor's understanding of their strategic environment, which is itself nourished by a background conception of the national interest, which itself is informed by the deeper temper or character of the individual or community in question. Let me bring these threads together. When an actor, a citizen, soldier, or statesman, understands a particular action to be necessary or compulsory, the actor believes that they have no other choice, or indeed no better or more rational choice than X or Y course of action. That does not mean that other options are not at least nominally open to the actors, but rather that the actor cannot or will not entertain those courses. To apply this to the outbreak of the Peloponnesian War, it became necessary when Athens and Sparta understood themselves to have no alternative to it. Now, this would be a banal statement, a formal statement, if Thucydides had not also revealed those key decision points and their consequences, the actual chain of events whereby the principal actors, including middle-rate powers, progressively arrived at the knife's edge of a Peloponnesian War. One of the things that I believe that I approved in my monograph is that Thucydides' first book programmatically surfaces the differing necessities, the imperatives of the national interest of the major players. War became inevitable, in other words, when the actors themselves conceived of no better or no more reasonable course of action than war, the result of a process by which the perceived range of available options had progressively narrowed, ultimately leaving only the option for war remaining. Or to use modern language, war progressively became a path dependency for both Athens and Sparta. The objective necessity for that great war then was the product of the subjective necessities of the actors. Now this obviously abridges and flattens out a more complicated story. If any of you want more, the book contains a much more tedious exploration of these issues. But all of this does mean, what's the implication? That the argument that Thucydides' claim about inevitability is solely a third English claim and must be mistaken. Okay? So I need to make a final point, and then we can turn more fully to the US-China relationship and a concluding meditation. In addition to showing how Athens and Sparta differently conceive of their interests, Thucydides makes it clear that the two principal cities had opposing vision of their city's place in the world itself, or more accurately, differing visions of the world. Today we might call these disparate cultural outlooks, or more loosely and provocatively what Huntington termed a clash of civilizations. These deeper background views naturally informed the Greek city's conception of their strategic interests. So to deploy the language of IR constructivism, identities and interests are indelibly bound together, while there's a history of the city's foreign policy that shapes both. So to put Thucydides in the ill-fitting clothing of our modern frameworks, he is a realist, a second English theorist, and also a constructivist. So what does that all mean for the Thucydides trap? You will recall the somewhat dismissive quotation about the Thucydides trap by President Xi Jinping of China. Let me repeat it, quote, "There is no such thing as the so-called Thucydides trap in the world. But should major countries time and again make the mistakes of strategic miscalculation, they might create such traps for themselves. But in my view, this is the trap, strategic calculation or miscalculation in the shadow of a shift in the balance of power. So how should we, as analysts and observers of international political life, think about the United States and China if we wish to grasp how the actors might avoid dangerous miscalculations? The first thing I think to say is that regime character matters. For many years, China has been a conservative power with regard to its foreign policy. Here we might think of Deng's hide and divide strategy, riding the proverbial tiger of an enormous domestic modernization effort, while steadily growing its capabilities, helped in recent years by its galloping double-digit economic growth rates. China's growth rates since 2001 are staggering. The United States, by contrast, has been a more aggressive or daring power in terms of its overall foreign policy, taking advantage of its hegemony in the Western world with a thank you to Teddy Roosevelt to project its power far from home. In the South China Sea, U.S. forces are deployed in China's backyard, while China, for its part, is energetically expanding its power and control over the islands surrounding it, the so-called Scrappy chain, over which it views itself as having a sovereign claim. Its militarization of this chain, the Scrappy chain, is an example of this, and so too its consistent insistence on the 9-dash line, which no other country acknowledges. But this again is China's backyard, though here I should note that $3.3 trillion in shipping moves through the South China Sea. Chinese aircraft carriers are not cruising the Gulf of Mexico, and it is doubtful the United States would be cheerful about that deployment. China's A2D2, its area access aerial denial strategy, is moreover geared toward pushing U.S. forces out, or more precisely, having the capability to hinder significantly U.S. naval operations in the South China Sea to increase the costs under which those naval operations are functioning. Essentially, at least in part, to prevent the United States from aiding Taiwan quickly enough in the event of a conflict between Taiwan and mainland China. For my part, I am not terribly optimistic about the odds of Taiwan's long-term independence from China. And the recent near miss that I've mentioned between the USS Decatur and a Chinese warship in October of 2018 is a very concerning event indeed. What if China were to sink a US destroyer, even unintentionally, under rules of engagement when ships get this close? Anything can really happen. A lot depends on the individual commanders. A lot can happen. No one can want an escalation, and there can be an escalation. In these circumstances, the danger of moving up the so-called escalation ladder is real, particularly when these naval forces are so very close together. Indeed, I would not be surprised if China were ultimately to implement an air defense identification zone in the South China Sea as it did in 2013 in the East China Sea. This zone in the East China Sea covers the disputed Senkaku Islands, with both Japan and China claim. Air defense identification zones for their part are usually implemented over undisputed territory, and thus there was significant outcry over China's unilateral move in the East China Sea. To return to our Thucydidean frame, we need to grasp that the regime characters of Athens and Sparta are, at least for the moment, reversed in the case of the US and China. To speak of a Thucydides trap, then, or to think critically about how war might break out between rising and ruling powers, I personally think it might be helpful to map out situations where, first, we have a cautious riser and a cautious maintainer; second, situations in which we have a daring riser and a daring maintainer; third, situations in which we have a daring riser and a cautious maintainer; and fourth and finally, circumstances in which we have a cautious riser and a daring maintainer, with the last capturing something of the US-China dynamic. Though I should emphasize again in this context, China has become increasingly assertive in recent years under Xi Jinping, and it assuredly aims for regional hegemony over the medium and long term. Here we might perhaps think of Xi Jinping as a Chinese analog to Teddy Roosevelt, a comparison that Graham Allison will also make. With regard to the scheme I've just outlined, my strong intuition is that the most dangerous dynamic with regard to the prospect of war over the changing balance of power and of strategic miscalculation is a circumstance where you have a daring/aggressive maintainer and a daring/aggressive riser. To return to the contemporary moment, Xi Jinping came out of the critical 19th Party Congress in Beijing in October of 2017 with an enormously strengthened domestic hand. And I would expect China under his rule to continue to take a progressively more aggressive or assertive stance across any number of strategic issue areas. Xi's China Dream slogan, incidentally, resembles Trump's Make America Great Again. Both argue for a return to past historical greatness through national strength. And for China, this is after what some of you may know, it refers to as its century of humiliation. As China's sphere of influence expands and interferes more directly with the prerogatives of Japan or of Taiwan, these political communities will surely turn to the United States for security assistance, since this will be the only way to counterbalance rising Chinese strength. And as one of my colleagues who works on these issues has pointed out to me, one interesting potential development here in the context of the Trump administration's policy toward Asia is its support for a more militarized Japan, which would act as a hedge against a rising China. It's perhaps no accident in this context that Japan's Shinzo Abe was one of the first leaders Trump met when he became president. As many of you will know, alliance politics produced the sparks leading to the Peloponnesian War. If we wish to be on the lookout for a Thucydides trap, then, entangling alliances are surely one flashpoint to watch. We can only hope that the recent failure of the meeting between Trump and Kim Jong-un will not lead to increased tensions on the Korean Peninsula. China, for its part, has no interest in an unstable North Korean regime, which is why it provides it with an economic lifeline despite the crushing sanctions imposed on that country. But China also has no strategic interest in the end of a pro-Chinese regime on at least one half of the Korean Peninsula. China certainly does not want a unified Korean Peninsula under the control of South Korea. With reference to North Korea, Allison himself has raised the terrifying spectacle of US and Chinese special forces meeting in a track race to secure North Korea's nuclear arsenal in the event of the regime's collapse. And on that note, let's turn to the more unpredictable Donald J. Trump. Among those who wish to defend Trump, some have pointed to Richard Nixon's madman theory of foreign policy, whereby political irrationality is deployed for rational purposes, to confound the expectations of one's enemies and rivals, and thereby to shift the parameters of future accommodation through the projection of an unsettling indeterminacy. Acting like a madman can sometimes change the status quo by reshaping the expectation or strategic calculations of other, saner actors. Such a strategy is predicated on reaping the solid benefits of unpredictability, and indeed on other actors being saner than you are. But of course, there can also be strategic costs to unpredictability, particularly in highly charged circumstances where other players have immovable red lines. And of course, the general embrace of brinksmanship can lead to a terrifying security dilemma, whereby several madmen all attempt to exceed the others in madness itself until all of us go over the proverbial cliff and, to mix metaphors, fall headfirst into a mushroom cloud. On the campaign trail, Trump used a great deal of heated rhetoric about China, mainly on the economic front. And as you may recall, he went so far as to take a phone call from the president of Taiwan, a truly unprecedented act for American president-elect, and one that, at least for a hot moment, called into question his administration's commitment to America's longstanding one-China policy. Trump now appears to have walked back that particular symbolic provocation, although he is engaged in others. The issue of Taiwan is surely a big Chinese red line. Indeed, one question we need to ask about American foreign policy in the age of Trump is whether Trump himself has a full grasp of the symbolic importance of certain actions. As we all know, Trump believes in winners and losers. Loser is perhaps the worst word in his dictionary. And he also believes in rubbing the losers' noses in their losses. So as someone who teaches American foreign policy, I can tell you that one of the continuing questions for observers of the Trump administration is who actually speaks for Trump on a given issue. On the economic side of the U.S.-China relationship, for example, the economic nationalists have clearly won over against more conventional Goldman Sachs people. In the security space, Trump has offered mixed signals. He has made glowing statements about Xi Jinping at various points, but Steve Bannon, the former White House advisor, has remarked the U.S. will probably go to war over China's militarization of the Spratlin chain and China's rising power in the South China Sea within, say, 10 years. And indeed, under Xi, China has been consistently developing a military presence on these uninhabited islands, the Wall of Sand, they call it. A recent U.S. admiral called it the Wall of SAMs, surface-to-air missiles. There are a number of anti-ship and a number of missile weaponry that have been put on these movable islands. Immovable aircraft carriers, as some people are calling this Chinese buildup, on these disputed territorial islands in the South China Sea. China is progressively creating facts on the ground or facts on the sea, and at the rate and pace of these moves is only increasing. And so too, China's firm commitment to the 9-dash line, which again, other nations do not recognize. I expect that we're going to see a greater number of Chinese provocations associated with American and America's allies, freedom of navigation operations in these areas. And this again is a dangerous flashpoint when ships and militaries get so close to it. So sort of to wind down here and then to open up things for your questions, in addition to potential Trumpian provocations and Xi's own increasingly assertive policy stance, there is also the possibility that China will become more generally assertive as the Chinese Communist Party relies more heavily on a nationalistic or jingoistic rhetoric toward outsiders or foreigners to generate unity at home. This, as you will recall, is one argument as to why China has heretofore been so cautious. The regime fears rocking the foreign policy boat given its domestic situation, a slowing economy, etc. But foreign policy adventurism in the face of enemies abroad and indignities to the national honor is surely one way of unifying the people behind a regime. In other words, stated in the form of a question, does the regime character of the power that is itself rising begin to change, if slowly and asymptomatically, along with its increase in relative power? So as Chinese power grows, does China become more assertive, even though it was initially cautious? Now, Graham Allison, for his part, does not advocate that either the U.S. or China abandon its national interests. Instead, to use my formulation, I suspect he wants both powers to be fundamentally cautious. He wants the United States to intentionally and self-consciously adopt the role of a cautious maintainer, and he wants China intentionally and self-consciously to adopt the role of a cautious riser, since this dynamic will give the actors the best chance of weathering the structural frictions that will surely produce individual and specific flashpoints in the years to come. Such a policy will require very clear lines of communication between the U.S. and China, along with a grasp of the other's very differing vision of the world, and its perception of its evolving strategic circumstance, and a deep awareness of the red lines of the opposing sides. Although my vision of the Thucydides trap is different than Allison's, I am again broadly sympathetic to his efforts. Conflict is more likely than many realize. That does not mean disfavored or never. One of the clear lessons of Thucydides' history is that events can all too easily develop a frightening logic of their own, that we have less control than we know. I think one of the Thucydidean teachings is that it is a human conceit to think we have more control over events than we may in fact have. So one central Thucydides trap to avoid then is to avoid those dangerous circumstances where we can all too easily become the playthings of our circumstances. And in this, I think a recreated war can be our violent teacher, a gentler teacher than any actual war. So thank you very much. I'd be happy to field any questions.